The premier magazine when it comes to college football previews is Phil Steele's College Football Preview, and the man himself joins us now here on 365 Sports, Phil Steele. Phil, we were talking about this when we found out we were going to have you. You have been doing this for a long time, and you have a method to everything you do and a calendar. And then the last couple years, college sports has not taken into account your calendar when they've changed these rules. With the transfer portal, how much more difficult does it make it to get the most accurate information into the magazine before it goes to print every year?
Yeah, it made it a lot more difficult, Paul. And I'll go back to maybe 10 years ago. I was able to put the magazine, send it to the press, maybe the middle of May or towards the end of May, easily send it to the press, have that thing on the newsstands by early June or middle June at the very latest. And, one of the axioms in the magazine business that I was told when I started was you got to be the first or second or third magazine on the shelves because those are the ones they buy and then people run out of money. But the good news is when people get my magazine, they'll sit around and wait for it. And so what I've had to do thanks to the transfer portal, is move our things back. And this year, with transfer portal closed May 15th, so we actually went to the press 3 weeks later. I not only knew everybody that hit the portal, but I knew where 99% of them signed in those 3 week period. All the coaches have my cell phone number. I told them, you text me before June 7th, and I will get them on the page. And so I was getting texts on June 6th. We're scrambling around, changing pages, adding players to it, changing the write-up. It makes it a lot more frantic in the final couple of weeks. But the good news is we captured the majority of the transfer portal moves, and as frantic as it was, very pleased with the final product.
Well, that is amazing. I can only imagine what June 5th and 6th are like among you and your staff, making sure you get it right. This is an interesting year as we head into the last year of the 4-team playoff before we go to 12. We've got, conference realignment, new leagues, and, the last year of the Big 12 is going to have 14 teams. Texas picked by the media to go number one. How do you see the Big 12 shaking out this year with 14 teams, the 4 new ones, and everybody who's come into this mix?
Wow, the Big 12, and taking you behind the scenes a little bit, David, you go back to when I did the first write-through of the magazine this year, I pretty much knew who I was picking in 9 of the conferences, or 9 of the 10 conferences out there, and I said, feeling pretty good shape. There's only one conference that I have a tough time finding one. I have a tough time finding 14. And guess what conference that was?
The Big 12?
Yeah, you betcha. And let's look at the last 2 years. I mean, Baylor won the Big 12 2 years ago, and TCU is playing in the national title game despite being picked in the middle of the Big 12. It used to be easy, and I even told Coach Leipold, I said, Coach, you're making it tough on me. I used to be able to at least pick Kansas last and then worry about the rest of the Big 12, and I can't even do that anymore because he's got Kansas so much improved. So it is a very tough conference to pick. But this year, believe it or not, I went with Texas and Oklahoma as the 2 top teams. And I didn't want to do that because I figured everybody's going to give them their best shot this year, especially like a team like Texas, which is the only one in the league of the top 6 teams that plays each of the other 5. A brutal schedule, but talent-wise, if you look at my rankings on page 138, I've got them either first or tied for first in all 8 positions. They just are a very talented team despite the tough schedule. And with Oklahoma, their defense will be improved under Brett Venables. When I went over the squad with him, it was a major priority. And last year, he runs a very complex defense through the entire thing at him. Now they're in the second year of the systems. He brought in a lot of transfers. Offensively, Dylan Gabriel is back. And actually in Vegas right now, Oklahoma is actually favored in 11 of their 12 games this year. So I do think Oklahoma and Texas are at the top. But I tell you what, if we had an hour to talk, I could make a case for Kansas State winning it. I could make a case for TCU winning it, Baylor winning it, Texas Tech winning it, Oklahoma State winning it, even UCF. And then how do you leave out an Iowa State, which was so much better than its final record last year? So I could make a case for about 10 teams winning this thing.
UCF is the one you mentioned that a lot of people think have the best odds of competing right away in the league week in and week out. Is that because of they probably have the best combination today of coach and quarterback?
Yeah, and overall experience, too. We can't forget about that. They're actually number 9 on my experience chart. And when I talked to Coach Malzahn, he said he's been preparing for the move to the Big 12 for 2 years now. He's been recruiting like they're moving to the Big 12. And I really like the talent they have. They got practically the whole unit back from last year, number 9 on my experience chart. And last year they lost a couple games. Remember, they went into Tulane and won. And I thought they controlled that game for pretty much. Without John Rice Plumlee, they struggled against Tulane in the AAC title game, or else they would have won it. Plumlee's back. They've got a better backup this year with Timmy McClain, who comes over from South Florida. So if any of those 4 newcomers are going to actually contend in the Big 12 this year, UCF is your team.
Phil, we cover Baylor. We've covered them for years, day in and day out. As this show has grown, we've covered more and more teams. But when people asked me at Big 12 Media Days last week how Baylor's going to be, I struggle to tell them for sure. Usually I can get, a handle on it, but they have so many new players and there's so many X factors. How do you break down the Bears coming off what was a really disappointing season last year?
Yeah, and last year they were the preseason favorites by the media to actually win the Big 12 last year and open up decent. They were 6-3. It wasn't overwhelmed with the loss to BYU. That one, the crowd, I think, played a major factor. And then the loss to Oklahoma State at home surprised me a little bit, and the loss at West Virginia. But still 6-3 after that win against Oklahoma, and there's just a poor finish to the year. I find Coach Aranda is one of the most fascinating coaches I talk to each and every year, and I always learn a lot, not just about football, but maybe about life as well. And I think he's going to get this thing turned around this season. I mean, 2 years ago, it seemed like when we got to the end of the year, Baylor expected to win those close games, and they did. And he pointed out to me that last year, maybe that same belief wasn't there, and maybe that had a little something to do with the 1-point loss to TCU, with the close loss to Texas, where it was highly competitive in the fourth quarter. And so I think that this year's Baylor team sets up better in that respect. They're stronger at quarterback. Blake Shapen's going to be a vastly improved QB this year. I like bringing in Dominic Richardson to go along with Reese and Washington and Jones at running back. The offensive line, a bit of a question mark. That's probably my biggest question mark on the team. They're more athletic than they were last year on the offensive line, but they lack experience. How quickly that unit comes together, probably going to be the key. Now, the switch coordinators on defense, they're going to run a defensive scheme more in Dave Aranda's style of defense, which I like a lot because I think Dave Aranda was one of the best defensive coordinators out there. So I'm bullish on that. And then when you look at the schedule, how many games on their schedule, Paul, do I have decided within 3 points? Utah, Texas, at UCF, Cincinnati, Kansas State, TCU, all those games are winnable and also losable. So I agree with you. It's a tough team to forecast, but if I had to say, are they going to be improved or weaker, I'm definitely saying they're improved on last year. In fact, they make my most improved list coming off a losing season, and I think this team could be a legitimate contender in the Big 12.
Well, I know we have a lot of people that love to hear you say that, Phil, as they get excited for the season. Going out nationally, this is an interesting year. I mean, SEC Media Days, they're not going to pick Alabama to win the SEC West. LSU is going to be the favorite there. Georgia trying to three-peat. They have a very favorable schedule to get at least back to the SEC championship game without a lot of problems this season. How do you see the SEC shaking out, some of the other big names in the country contending for that 14 playoff?
Yeah, and I did go with Georgia. I mean, experience-wise, they lose 5 draft picks, right, on the defensive side of the ball. But last year they lost 9. They're actually more experienced on defense than last year. And offensively, the only question is Carson Beck. And Carson Beck's got a tremendous supporting cast. My number 1 rated offensive line, number 4 receivers, number 6 running backs. And they'll be a double-digit favorite in their first 10 games. So by the time they get to that first real test at Tennessee, he'll have 10 starts under his belt. He's no longer a first-year starting quarterback. And it's his 4th year in the system, for crying out loud. Plus, he was one of the highest-rated quarterbacks coming out of high school. I think he's a legitimate Heisman contender at the end of the year. Yes, I expect Georgia to run the table. Alabama, I can't discount Nick Saban. And the last 2 years, they've been preseason number 1. He's only won the national title once when preseason number 1. And last year, while they were 11-2. Keep in mind, their two losses were both on the final play of the game. Tennessee kicked a field goal on the final play. LSU was a 2-point conversion in overtime. So it was a miserable number 5 in the country, missed the playoffs last year. This is the type of year Alabama bounces back. Tons of talent. And while they're inexperienced, they don't even know who their quarterback's going to be. It could be Buckner, Milroe, or Simpson. You never discount Nick Saban. Too much talent there. I do think Alabama makes the playoff this season. Two other teams to look at. The Big Ten East is tough to pick. You've got Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State are all right there talent-wise. But of the three, Michigan's got the best schedule. They do get Ohio State at home. They have to play Penn State on the road, toughest road game of the year. Other than that, the schedule is very manageable for them, probably a double-digit favorite in all the rest of their games. And this is Jim Harbaugh's best team that he's put on the field and involved in national title contenders this year. They're one of the few that has an experienced quarterback in J.J. McCarthy, who I expect to open up the offense a little bit more. They didn't trust him that much last year. They'll trust him more this year. He's got my number 1 set of running backs, number 2 offensive line. I've got Michigan making the playoff. And then in the ACC, I think the preseason favorite will be Florida State by the media. But I actually went with Clemson. And talking to Coach Sweeney and going over the squad with him, you remember that 2018 defensive line they had, which was loaded with number 1 draft picks and might have been one of the best that college football has seen. Well, he said this group doesn't have the star power of that group, but it's deeper in talent and experience than the 2018 group. I've got my best defensive line in the country. They've got Carter and Trotter back at linebacker. You look at Klubnik at QB. I think he steps in and does a good job. Shipley Amafa at running back, a veteran offensive line and receiving core. And Clemson's toughest 2 games this year are Notre Dame and Florida State. They get both games in Death Valley. They've lost a grand total of 1 home game the last 6 years in Death Valley. I've got Clemson running the table and making the playoff.
Yeah, Clemson and Florida State's going to be interesting, especially if Florida State's one loss in conference is Clemson. They will probably play each other again in that title game, but that's going to be Mike Norvell's bugaboo, right, is getting over the hump. Because you look at last year, who did he lose to? The 3 other good teams in the ACC and beat everybody else.
That's right. And it lost to Clemson at home last year. Mm-hmm. So that would be but I tell you what a difference it is for Mike Norvell, huh? Mm-hmm. David, last year he's on the hot seat coming off of 3-6 and 5-7 seasons. And now he's going to have a top 10 team coming into the year and the preseason favorite to win the ACC.
All right. Now, do you have a team that is, I guess if there were a stock, they'd be trending downward that people may not see?
Nobody really jumps out to me as someone that's going to take that drastic fall. I mean, you look at TCU, naturally, they played in the championship game last year, and now this year they lose a ton. They're one of the least experienced teams out there, number 110. But you're going over the squad with Coach Dykes, each position, he was like, we could be as good or better than last year. I think they'll still be under the radar. They're definitely not going to match last year's record. They're not going to match last year's win total, but could be a little bit better than some folks expect. But that would be one of the teams going down.
How will your approach change when building out what will be the 12-team playoff coming next year in the magazine, and how you may have to look at things differently, especially since when you're doing the magazine, you don't know what the committee is going to take into effect when it comes to those teams after about the top 5 or 6?
Yeah, it is a question, but each year I predict the team is based on where I think they'll finish at the end of the year. So I'll have probably the 12 teams that I expect to make the playoff in my top 12, and we'll see how it shakes out. I probably won't hit all 12, but I think I'll have a good percentage of them, and it's going to be fun and fascinating to watch out how that shakes out.
How many or who do you think is flying under the radar a little bit that may not, contend for the playoff, or maybe even, knock their conference title, on the door, but is trending upward that you like, that you can see making some moves in the next couple of years?
Well, I'm going to give you 2 teams that could very well surprise and make the playoff this year, despite everyone having zero expectations for them. The first one is the Wisconsin Badgers. They are my number 1 surprise team in the country. And Wisconsin's coming off a 7-6 season, fired their head coach, so they've got a first-year head coach. And you wonder how they change an offense is going to work. They're bringing in Phil Longo, who's going to throw the football more. And this has been a team built on the run game. However, after I talked to Coach Fickle, They're not going to abandon the run game whatsoever. In fact, they bring in Tanner Mordecai from SMU. And Longo's there, they're going to throw the football more. And Fickle seems to think that, and I believe him, that teams could stack the box in Wisconsin with 9 guys. They can't do that this year, and it's going to open up holes for Braylon Allen, Ches Malusi, 2 dynamic running backs, and they're actually going to have a better YPC and a better run game than last year, and he had the run game at Cincinnati. And then defensively, they only had 3 starters back last year. Well, this year they got 8 starters back. In fact, overall, the team goes from number 107 to number 20 on my experience chart, a gain of 87 spots. That means they're in for a good store there. And then how about the schedule? Schedule is always a big factor. They rode 5 road games this year against Washington State, Purdue, Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota, all winnable. Toughest 2 games are Iowa at home and Ohio State. Not only do they get them at home, they catch them the week after playing Penn State. So it wouldn't surprise me if Wisconsin, under Luke Fickell, who took a group of 5 team to the playoff, took this team to the playoff this year, despite coming off a 7-6 season. And then the other one is a team that had a losing record last year, but I think they're a legitimate title contender, and by a playoff contender, I should say. And that is Texas A&M. And they're another team that makes a big jump experience-wise. They go from number 124 in my experience chart all the way up to number 14 this year. And going over the team with Coach Fisher last year, we'd get to the end of each position, and then like the offensive line, he said, Phil, our offensive line is going to be one of the best in the country next year. A lot of those recaps said next year because they were so inexperienced. As it was, they lost Anaya Smith, their top receiver, after week 4. They had 3 different starting quarterbacks due to injury. Defense was banged up. Offensive line had 3 freshmen starting at times. This year, 10 starters back on offense, 10 starters back on defense. Vastly experienced. You know the recruiting classes he's been bringing in. And even last year, in their 5-7 year, everybody's talking about Alabama and LSU. Guess what? They beat LSU 38-23, and they were at the Alabama 2-yard line, down by 4 points at the end of the game in Tuscaloosa with a chance to win. The pass fell incomplete, and they ended up losing that game by 4. But they proved they could play with the big boys last year. They have a chance for a big breakthrough this year.
Well, and Jimbo Fisher certainly hopes so. And by the way, Tanner Mordecai, we did all his high school games. He's from right here in Waco. We did Midway High School. We did every single one of his high school games. He's going to be fun to watch in Wisconsin. Last thing we'll ask you, and it's because Smokey's not here, and plus we know the head coach really well, Matt Rule at Nebraska. How do you think he will do year 1? He is, jumped in the transfer portal a lot. He's known as a rebuilder, and he's got kind of 20 years of rebuilding to do in Nebraska.
Yeah, and Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So I don't think as great a hire as that was bringing in Matt Rule, who I love. I think he's one of the best head coaches out there, and it's a big upgrade from what they had with Scott Frost. I do have Nebraska on my most improved list. I rate him number 15 in the country, which means I think they're going to get to a bowl game. He does have better talent his first year than he had at Temple, and better talent than he had at Baylor his first year. And I like Jeff Sims at QB. I like the running back combo of Irvin, Grant, and Johnson, who, by the way, Coach Rule told me he feels all 3 have NFL capabilities. They had Billy Kemp over from West Virginia, wide receiver. There is good talent at Nebraska, and I think they get to a bowl game, but I don't see them contending in the West. I think the 2 best teams there are Wisconsin and Iowa, and they are still a couple steps ahead of Nebraska. So as you pointed out, Paul, they're going to need a year or 2 to get up to speed with the rest of the West, but should make a bowl game this year and make it a lot more fun for Nebraska fans.
Phil Steele, the Bible of college football when it comes to this time of year. Phil Steele's college football preview. Always love the magazine, Phil. You guys do an unbelievable job. Every time I pick it up and read it, I don't know how you can get this much information. It feels like a long time, I know, by the time the season ends and the time you have to do this, but considering how much information, it's a lot of work in a really short amount of time.
Yeah, we spend 7 months working on the magazine each year. It's in a 3 right-through process. And, I talked to 122 of the 133 head coaches. They each give me about an hour of their time to go over the entire team with them. So it is a long, long process. A lot of hours put into it, but well worth it, though.
It's a labor of love, right, Phil?
Absolutely. It's the only sport I follow, Paul.
Okay.
I don't even follow the NFL anymore. Just college football.
Well, look, and that's the best one. That's why we do this podcast all the time. So certainly, Phil, we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your summer and all these, I'm sure, tons of other interviews you got to do, and enjoy the college football season.
Hey, appreciate that, Paul. Thanks for having me on, and really enjoyed talking football with you today.
Yeah, thank you. That's Phil Steele, the great Phil Steele, with us here on 365 Sports. By the way,